Welcome everybody to our Do the Work series. I'm your host, Francesca Warren, founder of the Educator's Room. And today we have Dr. Matthew Shirrell. He's going to talk about this exciting study about the impact of student-teacher ethnoracial matching on exclusionary discipline. That's a lot. So we're going to start. You guys, in the comments, you know how we do it. Please put where you're from. Send us some good wishes. And Dr. Shirrell, am I saying your last name correct?
Yes, actually you
Okay.
did. So thank you.
Ooh, point.
That's amazing.
So I came across this study. I was on LinkedIn and I saw it and I was like, wow. And so I read through it. I was like, okay, this is interesting. So I know that there are two other authors on the study, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And then we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, Travis Bristol and Talani Britton, who are both at the University of California, Berkeley. Also, our research assistant, Rebecca Proctor, and the New York City Department of Education, who were very helpful as we did this research. But yeah, so about myself, I was an elementary school teacher myself for almost 10 years. I worked in schools first in Oakland, California. Then I came back to my hometown of Chicago and was a public school, elementary school teacher there. And, I think over time, I became very interested, even when I was in the classroom, sort of in kind of like the larger context of education and, policy. What were the bigger things that were sort of impacting schools? And so I was really interested, especially in kind of how schools and school systems either supported teachers' work or didn't. I worked in different schools that kind of had a very big range of sort of supports and structures for teachers. And I got really interested. I went back to grad school and I got very interested in sort of the teacher workforce, and really started reading these studies where we were, like, on one hand really realizing, I think the policy world was coming to realize that, teachers are very important, and like there's a really big difference if you have a really good teacher versus not, year after year. But then also that, we see such huge inequalities in the distribution of teachers, and also such inequalities in teacher turnover. We have some schools where I'm sure all people who are listening and watching know, you have some schools that are very stable and have the same groups of people working together year after year, and you have other schools with this churn constantly. And clearly, the students are very different who are experiencing those different kinds of environments. So I became very interested in that. And over time, I've done a lot of research related to different aspects of kind of teachers' work and collaboration and learning in education. And I'm really interested kind of overall in, like, how do schools and school districts either support or impede this work that teachers and others in education need to do. Because we know sort of intuitively, and also we know from research, that like when people work together, and the educators need to work together to try to solve these really hard problems, whether it's a kid who's having trouble reading, or a big issue at the district level. But how do we get people to be able to work together and collaborate better and learn? And so that's kind of the area I've become very interested in overall.
Well, that's interesting because you talked about your time as a teacher. I was a former high school teacher. Put us in the comments what you currently teach, guys, because I see you guys on the stream. I was a former high school teacher. I started my teaching career in Memphis City schools. And you are so right about the impact of teachers on student learning, and also on the idea of like teachers getting together to solve the issues. I've always said this, like, if you put the right people in the room, you can solve the issue. Like
Yeah.
like, especially in education. So, thinking about you teaching for that set of time and then you going into research, what did you find? What did you find about the research and the practice, like what a teacher goes through day to day? Was there a disconnect, or like, what did you find the biggest difference?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's a good question, because I remember, being a teacher, I think the hard thing is that, you don't have real time as a teacher, to really, kind of sit back and put your feet up and, read a journal article, not that anybody really wants to do that anyway. And so I think there's the issue, of, and I think this is an issue in our schools, like generally, that there's not really space created for, kind of teachers to kind of, not just research, but just sort of like work together. I mean, when in my days as a teacher, I was running from thing to thing, and I had 45 minutes, and I had to go make copies, and I had to go to the bathroom, and I had to do everything in that 45 minutes. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think there's just, it's hard. There's not space. And then I think there is, like you said, there's a disconnect. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think that, one thing you really realize when you go from like the K to 12 classroom into do more intensive research is just like, it's such a different pace. It's so slow. And research is very focused on like, making sure we really can have confidence in what we're saying is really true. And, 10 different people read all your work and give you comments. But by the time you get through to, the stage of having something to say, it's years. It's years. And I think that is one challenge. I think it takes a real adjustment for a lot of people at first, like, and I think that's something that researchers, struggle with, in a lot of different ways, So I think that was one thing that I remember really, and still stands out to me,
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons we do these, do the work series around current research, because like you said, most teachers, I never had time to read an article when I was in the classroom. I never had time to read research. I could hear about it. I could see it maybe on Twitter or, something if someone brought it into professional learning, but I almost never read research because my research was day to day. So the idea, guys, is you're watching this. I see you, Lori. I see you, Dalia. I see you, Brandon, Tammy, Cliff, Xavier, Gemma. As you guys are listening to this, is for us to get researchers in front of us, for us to have a conversation, and for us to use the research to help us as we navigate education post-pandemic. So let's talk about, how did you come to do this study? Like, how did this come to be? What brought this on?
Yeah. So, my one of my co-authors, Travis, and I had done some work together, looking particularly. So as I said, I've done a lot of this sort of teacher collaboration, kind of network research, sort of understanding, who do teachers talk to day to day and why. And Travis, some of you may know him. I mean, he's a real expert on sort of the diversity of the teacher workforce or lack thereof, and sort of why that is and what the consequences of that are and how can we sort of address those things. And so Travis and I have done some work looking at, particularly at kind of teachers of color, and actually kind of looking at that from a network point of view and saying, okay, how connected or unconnected are Black and Latino teachers in their schools versus. So we've done some work around that, and sort of thinking about kind of what the areas that we really don't know as much about. We came to this issue of discipline, and particularly the effects of Black teachers, Latino teachers, and Asian American teachers on discipline for students. And so this is an area that really people are paying a lot of attention to now, because like we're starting to understand a lot more that suspending kids from school in the big picture isn't necessarily an effective way of dealing with discipline in schools. In fact, it probably makes a lot of things worse, according to what research seems to say. And and again, this is something that's contributing to inequalities. It's not helping. It's actually making it worse. And so we started to think about that, and really um, there's a lot of evidence now kind of about the benefits of sort of diversifying the teacher workforce on academic outcomes, but we really don't know as much about discipline. And certainly we felt like as we were sort of looking at what research had been done, we especially didn't see much research out there that focused on like big urban school districts. And so, we had been, kind of like kicking around ideas of, in New York of things to do, and sort of partnering with the Department of Ed there. And so, we decided that this would be an important question to look at, in that, it's important for the reasons that I mentioned, and is a real focus of attention nowadays. And there's my dog. And it's a focus of attention, and it was something that sort of seemed timely and sort of was going to add to our knowledge, and hopefully, when we'll get into that, I'm sure we'll have some kind of practical implications.
Absolutely. Your dog sounds like my dog. My dog is right here, but let a squirrel go by and he's going crazy. And my kids are quiet just for right now. So it's totally fine. My dog is he's a big old dog. So he sometimes sees something and goes crazy. So it's interesting that you guys started to look at that. And, thinking about your research, and guys, I'm going to put it in the chat. We're talking about it, and I want to make sure you guys have a piece of it. Hold on one second. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. That's what I'll do, so you guys can get it. Or can you drop the link, Doctor? Is it easier for you? I don't know. No, I do. I have it right here. Sorry, I have it. So let's talk about this. Going into this work, this study, what were some of the things that you hypothesized that you would find, or that you believe to be true when you guys started this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seemed to us, it seems clear that um, there are tremendous benefits for students of having teachers who, look like them, sort of to put it, sort of in shorthand. Having teachers who sort of reflect the makeup of the students, has, as I said, been shown to students are, have better feelings about their own abilities. They are, they're more likely to sort of say that, I want to go to college. They're, we're really uncovering all this stuff. It's less clear exactly sort of what the mechanisms are and what's going on there, but I think it's pretty clear. And so, I think we came into this work sort of thinking that it really made sense for the same thing to really be true in terms of like discipline, right? Because, discipline is something that is in a lot of ways discretionary. Like teachers can kind of choose. I mean, there's some things, that are real, that there's no, kind of gray area about. But I mean, probably, and the people on here know that, the way the teacher responds to a student presenting with some sort of, behavior issue or whatever they're doing, it is, there's a lot of different ways to respond to the same thing, right? And you're bringing your own biases, your own, sort of frameworks, your own ways of thinking to that. And so we really thought that, it really made sense that, this was also an area where having a more representative group of teachers was really going to make a difference. I think what we weren't as clear about is, whether that was necessarily going to be true, to the extent that we would really be able to find it in a place like New York City. A lot of the prior work in this area has been done just sort of by coincidence in like state big states like in like the
Mm-hmm.
southern US
Yep.
particularly.
Yep.
So
Yep.
North Carolina, Florida, places like that, that and those states that like just have like happen to be very have data that's like well kept and that can be accessed for researchers. So it's not really anything particular other than that. But New York is it's a different place, and we wondered, okay, this is a very diverse setting. It's doesn't have the so we were curious about that, and whether sort of those findings that some other research had found would necessarily be also true in New York. But I think we had our suspicion and our belief was that this was probably something that made a difference. There had been some prior research, like in North Carolina,
Yeah.
and since then some more there's sort of more work coming out, I think, that's relevant too.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm reading right now. So, guys, just for some context, in preschool, and I'm reading directly from the study, in preschool, students of color are more likely to be suspended from school than children of other races and ethnicities, with Black students accounting for 43% of one or more preschool suspensions, despite only comprising 18.2% of U.S. preschoolers. Tragically, Black students continue to be suspended at a higher rate than their peers through their K-12 schooling experience. Disciplinary inequities often are also concerning among Latino students, in particular Latino boys. 1 in 5 male Latino students is suspended before they enter high school. That's interesting to me because I have wondered about this just in the bigger picture, is that some of the behavior that we see, do Black and Latino boys, is the behavior what they do compared to a white student, a white male student? Is it seen as, for the Black and Latino boy, is it seen as problematic? Whereas for the white male, it might be seen as like, oh, it's just boy behavior. So,
Right, right.
did that come up in the research, or am I jumping ahead of
Well,
myself?
no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, and I think that is what you are talking about has been supported by some really interesting research, not ours, but other work, that essentially the way that they do it is they look at incidents where two kids get in a fight, right? Or two kids are involved in a disciplinary incident, right? So it's the same incident, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
these two kids got in a fight at school. And even in those circumstances, the Black student gets a harsher penalty.
Mm-hmm.
And which would seem to support what you're saying,
Yeah.
that there
Yeah.
is sort of, overall, if you have two kids and they're involved in the same incident, you could say, oh, well, some people might say, oh, well, maybe these kids are they're breaking the rules more or something like that.
Yeah.
But then when you go down to when you have two kids that are getting in a fight, like a Black kid and a white kid, the Black kid is getting a harsher, suspended longer. And
Yeah.
there's several research studies that have looked at that data and found that. So I think that there is, again, it's kind of, and there's a study. I'll just one more thing.
Yeah.
Study that just came out that I haven't really had the chance to really look at in too much depth, but it essentially looked at the write-ups that teachers do after disciplinary incidents, and actually analyzed the sort of the language that teachers were using when they were writing about it. And again, sort of found that systematically teachers were using more kind of like I forget the word they used, but sort of more kind of like threatening kind of language
Yeah.
around Black students than they were around other students. So it is there is definitely work that supports that there is that picture. Now there's also sort of the in the bigger picture too, there's also the idea that also just by for example, having a if you're a Latino student, having a Latino teacher, that teacher can possibly, relate to you, connect with you, deal with you in ways that even prevent it from
Yeah,
getting to a disciplinary incident.
absolutely.
So I think there's the piece of like, how do they respond to things that happen? But then there's also this idea, I think, which makes sense too, which is like, they are creating environments that are just more supportive and are sort of preventative of this kind of thing.
Absolutely. And it makes me wonder. Well, let me go to this because I don't want to take up all your time just about theories of what I think because it doesn't matter. Um, what made you guys go to New York City knowing that it's so diverse? Like what was there something that drew you guys into New York City, or was it just the data was there? Or actually go back to that. The ethno-racial matching. Talk about how this research is a little different than what people may think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, what we're looking at, I mean, that's kind of it's kind of a mouthful, right? Ethno-racial matching. So I think you're right. Like, what does that mean? It's kind of a, yeah. If you went up to somebody and said that to them, they would they would have no idea what you're talking about. So I mean, what we're essentially looking at is, um, we were looking at students in grades 4 through 8, and we're looking at them sort of across. One of the advantages we have here is that we have a lot of kids, and then we can follow them across the years, right? And so we're essentially saying the proportion of your teachers, the number of your teachers who sort of have the same racial background as you, the proportion of those in any given year, is that related or not to the likelihood that you get suspended? That's kind of, and again, I mean, people often point out that, I mean, I think to your question about New York, I mean, I think one thing we were excited about New York is that, most of the prior research has really looked at Black students, Black and white, because it's like places like, North Carolina, there's not, especially, I mean, recently there's more, but it's really in terms of like numbers, that's sort of the comparisons you can make. And so we were very excited to be able to look at this, to have large numbers of students, of Latino students and Asian American students. So that was really something that really excited us about this, because I mean, it's a huge gap that we don't know much at all about, particularly about Latino students, because I mean, I forget what the number is, but we say that, I mean, a very large proportion of students in our public schools now are Latino, and in New York City as well, other big districts. So I think the challenge that people often point out is that, because we're using kind of administrative data, it's kind of a crude, ethno-racial matching is kind of a very general thing, so especially in a place like New York, being quote unquote Black, there are students who are immigrants from Africa. There are students who are African American and whose families have, there are, Jamaican, there's like many, and the same thing with Latino, the same thing with Asian. So, one challenge and shortcoming of, this study is that we can't really tease that out too much. And people often ask me that question. And, I hope it's something that, can be studied more, more particularly. I think you're muted. I'm sorry. Or at least for me.
I am. We've been how many years doing like Zoom stuff, and you still forget that you're on mute.
Or
So
maybe
one
your
of the
dog saw a
things.
squirrel.
No, no, you can hear me now though, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when we talk about because it's not just Black and Latino, but also
Mhm.
Asian American.
Yep.
And so some of the findings, let's talk about some of these findings because this
Mhm.
is super interesting, specifically around this negative associations between exposure to same race teachers and suspensions. In years that students in grades 4 to 8 were assigned more same race teachers, they were less likely to be suspended from school compared to years in which they were assigned fewer same race teachers. So let's talk about some
Mhm.
of these findings. Like what were some of the bigger ones that you found that you were like, oh, this we've got to study this further, or some of the
Yeah.
ones that you found that kind of was on the opposite end?
Sure. Sure. Um, yeah, and I just wanted to say something just since you mentioned that sort of about the research. Um, I mean, because I think it's an important point you made about sort of that we're looking at the same students over time, right? So just like before when I was mentioning that study where they had a disciplinary incident that was like the two kids in the same fight, and then looking at the discipline differences between the two students. What we're doing is we're sort of comparing every student to themselves. So, so we're saying, okay, you know, um, here's this student A, and this year that student, um, you know, did or didn't get suspended, and they had a certain group of teachers that did or did not reflect their background to a certain degree. Then we look at that same student the next year, and they had a different sort of group of teachers, and did they get suspended or not that year? And then we look at the same students, and so we're essentially only using sort of the within student variation over time. And so what that really allows us to do is get around this idea that like we're we're comparing within students because students who have different compositions of their teachers because they go to different schools, those students are probably different in a lot of ways, right? So comparing those students. So if I said, oh, students who, let's say Black students who have almost all Black teachers, you know, have a different suspension likelihood than Black students who have few Black teachers. Well, the problem with that, right, is that those kids are going to very different kinds of schools, right? Probably. Um, and that actually turns out to be true in our data. And so it's sort of like a apples to oranges comparison in a way that you're comparing kids in schools where they have a lot of Black teachers to kids who in schools who don't, and the students might differ, the schools are different. So sorry to go on and on about this, but I did want to emphasize that point that, really it makes us feel a lot more confident in our findings because we're not looking across schools. We're not looking at kids in different schools. We're looking at the same kid in the same school over time, and that kid had different groups of teachers from year to year, and then we're using that to say, oh, okay, this kid got suspended more or less in the different years.
Yeah,
So I mean,
and this is over a 10-year period, right? I want to be
yeah,
clear. Like this is from
yeah,
2007 to
yeah,
2017. So did you
yeah.
guys follow them through when they graduated?
No, I mean, so students. So we just focus on 4 through 8. So the most we could have
Oh,
student was 4, 5, 6, 7. So we could have students for 5 years.
okay.
But so yeah, we weren't. There was no students who were covered the whole 10-year period, but sort of throughout that period, essentially we had students, a lot of students come in and out, but we're sort of just using the ones who we at least have 2 years,
Okay.
because we need to be able to compare something.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so I think that in terms of the findings, what we found, which I think was sort of really the most striking, like big picture and interesting finding to us, was that essentially for Black students, which some prior research had looked at, but also for Latino students and Asian American students, it was all just about the same impact of the proportion of ethnoracially matched teachers on the likelihood that they were suspended. So, we sort of do some, and I can explain a little more about this, about sort of how we tried to figure out exactly what the magnitude of that was. But essentially, it was a significant, a small but significant difference. When you looked at, essentially what we were able to say was, if we could increase the diversity of the teacher workforce by this much, it would get us less suspensions of Black and Latino students and Asian students. So that was our kind of the main thing that we found. And it was relatively, it was pretty consistent across those three groups. We have a lot fewer Asian American students, so we're not able to as precisely, say we're 100% sure that this is actually that. But so we were, to us, this was an interesting and we thought was a pretty noteworthy finding to find this for these other groups particularly, but then also for all the students in a very different kind of context than has been studied before.
One of the things that was really interesting to me, and guys, if you're just coming on, I'll put the link to the study here again. But one of the things that was really interesting was, you talk about the findings that if you have more students, and I know I'm simplifying it, if you have more teachers who identify with students racially, and I know I'm not saying it right, and I know this to be true, that suspensions will lower, right? So you find this out in New York City schools. Was this used to increase the argument that we need to focus on a more diverse teaching force? Or is that something that I know you guys aren't responsible for, but to me, it would seem like one of the things that we need to do is to really make sure that we have teachers who look like the kids that they teach to help with this. So has there anything come of this research to say to even further make the case as we talk about discipline in schools?
Yeah. Well, certainly, we've had some, briefings and discussions with the New York Department of Education, and they are, and it's not just them. I think this is an issue of significant concern to people now.
Yes.
And I think, I think the issue of discipline is also in schools, this whole idea of sort of a, school to prison pipeline, this idea of, we're sort of channeling certain students into, our legal, system. And school discipline is actually, a lot of people have argued that that's a part of that. And so, what I think is hopefully people think about is the idea that these two things are not just like totally separate issues. This idea of school discipline and, how it's impacting students is a really big issue, but it really dovetails with this issue of diversifying the teacher workforce. And I think, sort of we've tried to say, let's bring these things together. And, I think it's just important to sort of keep that in the conversation because, it's like, as times change and priorities change, you sort of just want to keep these issues sort of in the forefront and in conversation with, school districts, states, thinking about, how they can allocate their resources. And New York has had a lot of success in both of these areas, in recruiting and, retaining particularly. And I know that's something that, my co-authors have worked on quite a bit, this idea of not just recruitment, but like actually having schools that support people so that we can keep a more diverse teacher workforce. Not just have them so we can say, oh, look at our numbers, and a year or two later they're gone. And discipline too. We talk about it in our full paper. New York has really, over the period even of our study, they have really changed their policies about discipline quite a bit, and made it much, sort of raised the bar for suspending, suspending students and having to justify that.
Yeah.
So, I think it is, it's interesting. It will be interesting to see, how these conversations kind of proceed. But yeah, we're trying to, kind of keep that in people's minds.
Yeah, and I really like some of the, when you talk about some of um, the recommendations for both practitioners and
Mm-hmm.
researchers. Like one of the questions that really made me think was when compared to their colleagues, how are Latino and Black teachers organizing their classrooms in ways that lead to lower rates of suspension for their Latino and Black students? I combined two questions. I think that's
Yeah.
interesting because I can remember being a young teacher teaching in Memphis City schools and teaching. I was 23 and teaching, and I can remember older teachers coming to me and saying, how do you get kids to do this? How are you, what does your classroom look like, right? After I got through the minutia of like managing a class and how difficult it is and all those things. So I like that next step because I feel like that is a critical piece of what are you doing.
Right.
Have you guys thought any more about that? Because I know it leads to the second recommendation, and I'll let you talk about that. But that's something that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, as we thought about it, and people, we, as over time, and have sort of pushed back on this issue of like, you're making all these recommendations about diversifying the teacher workforce. And, obviously that's tremendously important, but, we don't want, Black kids to only be able to be taught by Black teachers, and we
Yeah.
don't want Latino kids, we want to, I think part of this is that, like you said, what's going on here? And then I think also, I think that there's a lot of, you know, hypotheses about that and thinking about that, and there's a lot of research over the years
Mhm.
about,
He's frozen up just a little bit, guys. Okay, go ahead.
sorry, we know a lot about, like, implicit bias and our
Yeah,
bias,
yeah.
and we're doing, I think we're, a lot of school systems are making real efforts to try to get teachers, to train teachers about that, to be, critical about what, their own biases and how they're bringing them to the table. But, it's sort of an issue of like, what can we learn here? What are these teachers doing?
Hmm.
And, you know, what of it can we actually take and
Hmm.
teach people and use in the interests of sort of, making classrooms better for all kids, you
Yeah.
know?
And that's interesting because we have a comment on LinkedIn right here, Mark Gaskins. He
Mm-hmm.
said that churn that we see is often results in factions and power grabs for authority. Students can sense that tension, which makes the space unsafe for them. And I can like teaching in an urban district, being an administrator, like I this is real. Like there are factions of teachers who say, you know what, we're not going to do that, and we're going to make a grab for power. And it sounds like this old mobster movie, but this is really the truth, where you have people who actively work against what you're talking about and having a more diverse workforce and going from that. And kids pick up on that. They pick up on that, and sometimes that's where some of the behavior can come from. Making the space unsafe for them. So I agree with Mark for saying that. Thank you, Mark, for bringing that up. Did you guys see any? Well, let me ask you this. In the research, you guys looked at data. So you guys
Yeah.
didn't have any conversations with kids about some of the things. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and again, that's sort of the strength and the weakness of our study.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that, we need a lot more of the kind of research you're talking about where, and there is more and more of it, but, like to get down to that level of what are teachers doing around discipline, particularly,
Hmm.
what are the sort of like, how much of it is like just preventing things from becoming issues, and how much of it is the way they respond, you know, de-escalate, are they, you know, de-escalating things in a different way, you know, things like that. So I think that there's a lot of that research, I think, that still needs to happen. I mean, we sort of intended our study to be kind of like, hopefully can kind of catalyze and raise some of. Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, finish the very
We're
last
looking
part.
across all of New York City, you know,
Yeah.
over 10 years. So we have like, you know, 3 million pieces of data. And, you know, so the advantage of that is we're able to say, look, you know, we've used very, very careful research methods to sort of tease out what we can actually feel pretty confident that the teachers are contributing to this difference. But we can't get into like any of the sort of more granular stuff like at the classroom level. And like I said, there's more of that going on now. And like I said, the study that just came out about, you know, looking at the write-ups of the disciplinary write-ups is sort of a step closer to that. But you know, we need sort of that kind of like research, more of like people going into classrooms and just like watching and understanding that. So it's certainly, you know, something that, you know, I hope people out there take up, and even teachers, you know, you know, I mean, I think there's a huge space here for teachers to sort of do their own kind of reflective, you know, practice work. I mean, I think, you know, things like, you know, I mean, I know a lot of schools do these kinds of things where, you know, teachers have, you know, PLCs or sort of study groups where they're working on things. And I think, you know, sort of, if it's possible, you know, I think it's very interesting thing for teachers to really think about, and you know, keeping a journal or a log of, you know, how did I respond to these things, and sort of trying to look critically at that. I mean, I'm trying to do it as a professor.
Yeah.
You know, who do I call on?
Yeah.
You know, how much time are different people having to speak in the class? You know, like just that kind of self study too, I think can also be valuable.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I thought about, these the study that you're talking about, me and my colleagues have had conversations about this, right? I can
Right.
remember being in the teacher's lounge or in my classroom or going to someone's classroom and saying, how do you get such and such to
Yeah.
do what they need to do in your class? Because, and I'm not saying this is not a lie for us to say, suspension, I'm I don't know how I want to say it, but the suspension is not an option for certain things, right?
Sure.
But
Right.
it's one of those things where we've had these conversations where as I developed as a teacher, teachers will come to me, some of my white colleagues will come to me and say, how did you do this? Talk me through this. What does that look like? And it kind of gets to the second recommendation that you guys talked about, which was the need for professional learning around this. It should specifically, urban school districts should focus specific efforts on redesigning induction and ongoing professional learning for white teachers regarding discipline practices for students of color. That is something that's huge. So my question about this is needed, but also the flip side, where you're in a society now where people, the idea of race or is getting teachers fired in certain states.
Yeah.
So let's just use Florida, right? Let's
Yeah.
just use Arizona. Let's use some places where, I don't even know if the data's there, if they, done something with the data, so you can't see this. But what was the learning on that piece?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is, you know, again, it's an area that we really need to think about and focus on. I mean, I think what you're pointing out is very true. It's very, um, you know, this idea that we're just going to sort of stick our head in the sand and pretend like, you know, these things aren't there, is going to, you know, be so counterproductive to the kinds of learning I think we need to do. I mean, I think that to the extent that, I mean, because I had experiences like you're describing, when I was a first year teacher, and my students are going, just, I didn't know what I was doing. And we had an African American woman, experienced teacher. I mean, she walked in the room and it was like the moment she crossed the threshold into the room, it was like quiet, and it was like, and so, but I think it's sort of like, you can't just, I feel like we can't really just stop there and say, oh, well, she had it, I didn't. I mean, I think we need to sort of really get into that and say, because there may be some of that, I just can't do because I'm not African American. I'm not, but on the other hand, if, there are practices that teachers are employing in terms of the way they respond to things, in terms of the way they, structure their classrooms.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's a lot that can be learned there, but it's going to be, it's going to be sort of short circuited and not allowed if we can't even like acknowledge that, like, there are these differences.
Yeah.
And I worry that's where we're headed, because like you said, it's like in a lot of places we're coming into an environment where it's like teachers are looking over their shoulder because with their students and probably with their colleagues too, it's sort of like, they're not allowing teachers to, I mean, this is probably some of the people who are listening
Yeah.
are experiencing this. We can't have professional development about, I mean, we talk about this in the paper, this sort of idea of implicit bias. I mean,
Mhm.
we have to be able to like dig into this stuff and figure it out.
Yeah.
And and not all of it may be things that we can teach everybody, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to be done, and I do hope that it requires sort of some honesty about what's what's going on.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. When I taught in the last school district I taught in, we had a teacher, and this is probably its own study, but we had a teacher who came in. He was a new teacher, and he had actually been a prosecutor. He had been
Mm,
an attorney. He had been a prosecutor, and he wanted to teach because he was saying on the flip side, and he might be watching. Tom, if you're watching this, just leave a comment. You need a whole study done on your work, but he felt like he could stop the kids getting into the criminal life if he taught them, and he happened to be a white man, and there were things he could do with his students that I could never do.
mm, mm,
And it was interesting to see those dynamics. So, in this society where we're talking about where teachers are afraid to teach books, where they're being villainized, if race is even mentioned. This is a study that I think is so interesting because we do know as teachers, we do know that not all behavior deserves a suspension, right? There's a threshold of where a relationship, or I don't want to say relationship, but an understanding and the right classroom structures can stop some of these behaviors, right? But
right.
it's also interesting around, our recruitment practices of teachers of color, which makes me think when I read you guys' study, how much recruiting is done at HBCUs? How are we getting more Asian professionals into the profession? How are we getting Latino teachers into the profession? So it really has made me think because there's just some lasting things.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
Policymakers. The last recommendation was policymakers in large urban school districts should maintain and augment. Well, we just talked about this. Augment their teacher diversity recruitment and retention efforts. Like it's not good enough just to get teachers of color, black teachers, Asian teachers, Latino teachers, but how do you maintain them? What did you guys find with that?
Well, I mean, I think in the bigger picture, thought about is this idea of, you know, it's not just recruitment, but it's also retention and support.
Mm.
Um, and, to the question or the comment that was made here about churn and power grabs, and it's 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 also really you know making schools better workplaces
Yeah.
for everybody, but particularly for teachers of color. I mean, if we want to retain, people, it's like, people have other options now. I mean, our education system sort of, had this kind of hidden subsidy for many, many decades, for a very, very long time, because, other professions, were not open to women and to African Americans, to Latino people, so those people became teachers. And now they have the option to be lawyers and doctors, and open their own business. And so, the opportunities weren't as great before. And so, we sort of, you know, got a, we got along on that for a long time, I think. And now, I think this is just true in education generally, but it's like particularly true with the kind of diverse teacher workforce that we need, is that, we have to make schools, supportive places where teachers can work together and learn, because the work is very hard. And, I worry that, we are we're focusing so much on recruitment, which I think is an important step. But, it's sort of, what happens after that? What happens after that is, also has to be paid attention to.
Absolutely. So we've talked for like 51 minutes. It hasn't felt like that. What is there anything? Is there anything either for the audience? So if for the audience, you guys have 8 minutes to ask. But for you, was there something about the study that we didn't talk about that you're like, I've got to talk about this? This was super important to me or to my other two co-authors.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one interesting finding for me in particular, we haven't talked about, was that, so what we found was that essentially, like, the effects that we found of having more matched teachers were were essentially the same for Black boys and Black girls. So that was an interesting finding to us, and it was not true for Latino students or for Asian American students. So for those two groups, the effects were all concentrated among boys, pretty much. But for African American students, it was boys and girls. And so I think that's something that we sort of talk about a little bit in the paper. And again, sort of, I think it's something that, we can think about as sort of this, like, there's sort of this, the interaction of gender in schools and sort of race, ethnicity, and those kinds of things. So I think, to me, that was a notable finding. A lot of the research sort of focuses on boys because, like a lot of the disciplinary, infractions are committed, our suspensions are mostly boys anyway. But sort of the fact that we found that was true for Black girls as well, I just think is something that sort of is another piece of information that we need to think about and kind of explore more.
Absolutely. Where can, so people are hearing this, we've put the link to the study in the chat. It is in the chat. What is next? Like, what comes next? What are you working on currently? How can people reach out to you if they're saying, look, I'm really interested in this topic. I'm doing something similar at another university, but it's
Yeah.
something different. How can they reach out to you, and like, what's next in the
Yeah.
research around this?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. No, I'm happy for people to reach out to me. Hopefully, maybe you can share my email address, or I can put it in the chat. I'm happy, to have questions or talk to people about stuff. And that would be great. And so, yeah, I mean, this is ongoing. We're continuing to do some work in New York, and my colleague Talani is looking particularly at sort of college counselors and college going. So she's focused on older students, high school students, and sort of trying to understand about sort of the composition of college counselors, and then looking, particularly, we have a lot of data from the community college, the city university system in New York, and sort of looking at not just college going, but hopefully we can also look at like persistence in college, those kinds of issues. So we're doing some work around that. And yeah, we're also kind of doing some more work kind of around academic issues, and particularly again in New York, to try to understand the impacts of a more diverse teacher workforce on academic outcomes for students. And hopefully, I'm hoping to do more work sort of on these kind of what we've talked about kind of like teachers' decision making, particularly around discipline, which would require kind of a very different kind of research. But yeah.
This is great. Guys, this is so important. Every month we bring you a new study that we're looking at, that we want to have questions about. There are lots of people watching. I think people are going to replay this. I've put Dr. Shirrell's email in the chat, so you guys can access that, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on LinkedIn, or whether you're on Facebook. Anything. So, we have 4 minutes left, so we do a speed round, and we talk about this really fun. I usually don't tell people about it. So are you ready to play it?
Okay, sure.
Okay, you got to answer the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay. Favorite ice cream?
Mint chocolate chip.
Okay. City that you love forever?
Oh, Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Best book that you've read?
Ever? Oh, my favorite book is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison.
Yeah. Favorite movie?
Oh, it changes. Probably Big Lebowski.
Okay. For a teacher who's watching this and says, I want to do more research. I'm going to leave the classroom. I'm going to go back to school and get my PhD. I want to do more research. Give us 3 things they need to do to make this a reality. They want to do what you do.
Well, that's a very good. I don't know how speedy I'll be in this.
It's okay. You don't have to be speedy on that one.
Okay. I think that I think they have to be patient, because I think it takes an enormous amount of time, like I said, to sort of wrap your head around something. I think that my students, often what can be challenging is that as a researcher, you are have to be very conscientious about sort of like making a contribution to knowledge. And sort of in order to do that, you really, really have to know what is already known about your topic. So there's a lot of reading, a lot of, and sometimes I think people are sort of, want to get through that. And I think that's very important. So I think, the patience, I think, some, amount of kind of like resilience, and sort of like, I'm going to do this. And, there's a lot of ups and downs of this whole process, and it's kind of bizarre. But I think that sort of, persistence. And then I guess the last thing I would say is, really use your experience, like don't pretend like you just have to forget everything that you've done in your time in the classroom. I think, that is very valuable, experience that you have. And so that can give you a very good kind of built-in, BS detector, having been there and done it, and I think that can be very valuable. So I guess those would probably be the 3 things I would say.
I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Shirrell. This has been a great conversation. We only had an hour. We could talk about this for days, all the theories that I have, but it really is not research. It's just my experience. Guys, join us next month. It'll be in September. If you're not on our email list, please put your email in the chat or you can DM us and we'll add you to it. But these are free every month. If you know of research that you've read about and you're like, hey, I think we would love to see them on here, send it to us. Have a great evening. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Shirrell.
Thank you. Thanks.